So this year was our 19th student trip, and each year when we take this journey, each group sort of forms their own identity as to who they are and how they're going to learn, how they're going to function, and what they mean to one another. All those things seem to happen each year. And this year, in particular, this group really just, I don't know how it happened, but they just decided that journaling was a really big part of how they were going to record this trip. And you'll see in some of the footage in the film that they were constantly writing, constantly journaling. I have one student's journal here, and you can see that every single part of the page is not only covered with words, but also covered with drawings. And there was a lot of private reflection on the history. We had one student, as you'll see in the book, also write a lengthy poem about Auschwitz. Nia Rhodes from California wrote this poem as we left Auschwitz. So there was a lot of taking in the information and a lot of printed word that was coming out of this trip, in particular with this group. Some sharing it, some, it's private journal writing, but it really was sort of how they formed their identity as a group. As the students know, they also got along really well, which seemed to work out well for the entire group. As we look towards our next trip, which will be the 20th trip, one of the themes that we continue to think about in this experience is what we're learning, what's new about the places that we're visiting, and how we're sort of unsilencing history, which is the theme of this year's book. It's also the theme of our journey. And what does that mean? And as you'll see in this documentary, we learn all different kinds of new information in all the places that we visit.
I think something that's going to stick with me on the trip is the town of Lidice and the story behind it, because there's a lot that I can relate to in my life now that was related to the story of Lidice. You know, it was just a small town, and it's a town like the one that I live in now. It's small, and seeing that what happened to it was so, you know, out of the blue. It was from nowhere. It can happen to anyone, and that really scares me because they didn't know what was coming, and it may be possible now, it may not be, but it's something that I can relate to. It's a town. I live in a town. You know, there's teachers, there's schools, there's students, and all that is in my life. And you know, if they're living their lives to their fullest, and then all of a sudden something out of nowhere just comes in and destroys everything, you know, that may happen now. And, yeah.
So what impacted me, or what's going to stay with me and keep me thinking from this trip, was also Lidice, but not necessarily the town, how Nathan said, even though that was obviously a big part, but the children of Lidice, because like I said before, at one point, I have a lot of children in my family. I have a lot of little cousins, and my job after school, I work with kids. I'm constantly around them, and it makes me think of like the psychology of a person, like how they can do this to children, and like how some parents were sacrificing themselves for their children and pushing them away to save them, but how you have other parents, like Mr. Barmore told us the story of the 19-year-old mom who ran away from her child because she said she wanted to live. And then it also has me thinking about like Nazi soldiers who have their own families and they have their own children, how they can look a child in the eye and send them to a gas chamber to be killed, obviously knowing what's going to happen to them. So Lidice just makes me think about the kids a lot, and that's what's going to stay with me from this trip.
Tresice in the Czech Republic, when we were at the hideouts that's related to the Otto Wolff diary, in the distance we hear somebody calling us, and what we discover is a person that was a primary rescuer of the family, Slavak. His niece was in the area, was in Olomouc in the Czech Republic, and heard that the American students were visiting this memorial, and she came running to the hideouts with two of her relatives to say hello. She was here for a family reunion, and this was a part of the story for us that no one really could ever elaborate on. We knew he was one of the main rescuers, but we didn't know anything about any of his family, and as it turns out, this is someone who knew everything about her uncle, and so we're looking forward to learning more about that. She lives in the United States, in California, actually in the Bay Area, where Mrs. Sussman is going to be meeting with her and talking to her about what she knows about her uncle's side of the story. As it's really a part of the story that we don't really have any personal information. There are no testimonies. We just know from the diary he was a rescuer and from the family that he was a rescuer. But we really have not had any information about their side of the story. But apparently it's a family story that they hold very dear. Other places like Rabka, each year we visit there. Narcissus, the local electrician who actually discovered that he lives on the site where the former mikveh was and the synagogue, and he actually undug the steps of the synagogue, and he's beginning to, continuing to preserve that story. We continue to find out new information that he discovers. In fact, he recently was in Israel interviewing survivors of Rabka that remember the stories from that time period, and he's devoted his entire life to unpacking this history in which he lives on the property of where much of that history took place. So the trip always gives us so many opportunities to meet with people that continue to unpack this history and to continue to be the voice for this history. And that's one of the hopes that we hope for our students, is that as they journey in this experience, they become one of those voices. And they become that individual who's going to unsilence what has been silenced about this history.
One thing that really affected me was speaking to the Holocaust survivors such as Miss Doris and Mr. Fisher, because they took it upon themselves to share what they endured and the torture that they had to deal with through living through Terezin, and in Mr. Fisher's case, through going to Auschwitz and seeing his mother and his father and his sister all be killed by the Nazis, but still want to talk about what they went through in order to educate other people to prevent this from ever happening again. It means a lot to me, just because it's important to prevent genocide from happening again, especially since they do, they lived through this and they took it upon themselves to never want to see it happen again. And that, I think it's really brave of them to do that.
To me, the most was being able to meet Mr. Fisher, because, like, being a twin myself the whole time, I was just picturing what it would be like if my brother and I were there. Like, having to watch him suffer while you're also, like, not doing okay. And I just couldn't imagine being in a place where you don't know what's going on and, you're just there getting sicker and sicker and you can't do anything about it. And I just can't, like, fathom being forced in a situation where you're basically watching your other half, like, get sick.
So today we visited Tresice, and I found it what was like really unique, and like I guess what stood out to me the most was the memorial of the hideout, which was, I know you were part of that, so it made it special. And then the fact that we read his diary in class, so we had like background knowledge before we even got here, and then to learn about it and actually see where it was. And then also the fact that we had one of the family members of the main family that helped hide the Wolf family come and show up. That was really unique, and it kind of showed us that like the Holocaust isn't just in Europe, but it's all over the world, it's history, and that like coming together we can put like the puzzle together and figure out all these untold stories. And I guess it was like unique because you normally think like hideouts like, oh, like in a house or like under like a house or something like that, but you never really think in the woods, and to actually be able to see it was like, yeah, it was special.
And that they're still there.
Exactly.
I mean, the remnants of those hideouts are still visible to our human eye, which I think is incredible, and they've stood this long for how many years now? Right, since 1945. That's a long time. And lots of things could have happened, but for some reason the community kept them intact or somewhat intact and didn't allow for that somewhat sacred place to be destroyed on any level. And it wasn't until we had the conversation in 2008 about, well, this should be marked, that they decided that that was a good idea.
I don't know, I find it kind of like shocking too how like we spoke about how the whole like community knew that he was there and how nobody said anything. That's really shocking because like nowadays you tell somebody something and like 5 people know like 30 seconds later.
And Otto, in those 4 days of torture, protected the whole community by not giving them up.
Czarna noc, biały róg, złote They say if you pay attention, if you really, really listen, you can hear them. Men, women, children of varying ages. From men who fought for Germany, wondering why their country has forsaken them, to little girls watching the world with wide eyes. The throngs of people sent here to die. Parts of them are still here. Parts of them are in the ponds on the way, in the seats of German cars, lost forever to the air. But if you listen, you will find that their voices remain. I came from Prague, Łódź, Krakow, Berlin, Paris, Kiev, Odessa. The litany goes on. My name is... Go on, I'm listening. What are your names? Silence. Who remembers me? I can't answer. Who is there to remember you? Is there someone alive who remembers your laugh, your smile, the way you spoke? Is there someone alive who knows where you are? They say, if you pay attention, if you listen real hard, you can hear them. But their voices are quieter and quieter as time goes on, and few listen.
I think the thing that is going to stick with me most on the trip is at Auschwitz, when we were standing in the middle of Auschwitz-Birkenau, actually, and Mr. Barmer was telling us stories about what, I don't know if they were all survivors, but about like what people did at Auschwitz, and how like mothers had to push their kids away from them just to save them, and they couldn't stick together as a family always, or they tried to stick together as a family and they didn't always make it. And all those stories you could kind of relate to your own life. Like imagine being with your sister or brother in Auschwitz and having to like push one of them away so they could survive, and you have to like not live yourself. And all that kind of resonated with me, and that hit me pretty hard. So I think that's the biggest thing I'm going to take away from the trip.
I think the most important thing like that stuck out to me on this trip was about in like any of the camps, whoever got put in had like a little bit in charge took it like way more, because it's every man for themselves. So if you had like a little power over somebody else, you were completely different to them, even though you're exactly the same as them. And it just went to your head, because if you worked in the kitchen, you got more food. If you had to make sure everybody got up in the morning, you made sure before you got in trouble. And like, I think that's so important, because everybody was trying to survive, and they weren't worried about the other people. They were worried about, I need to get out. So.
What really stuck with me from the trip, and something I can't really stop thinking about, is the unsung collaborators. The people who could really be counted as perpetrators. What keeps coming back is 2 little pools of water in Auschwitz, because they did everything legally. There was a guy who came in, looked at the place, looked at the dozens of wooden houses which were designed to keep people like stock for a factory, industrial. The metaphor of factory has been used and used again. And they went, this is flammable. Put some water in here and it'll be up to code. That's it? That's it? You're not noticing the fact that thousands, there's a gas chamber right there. They're killing people. All you can worry about is a potential for fire, and then it'll be insured? What the?
So what stuck with me the most was when Mr. Barmer was talking about the 19-year-old young woman with her daughter, and how just easily she could give up her young daughter to save her own life because she had so many years to live. Like, I don't know how someone could just give up their own child just to save their own life. Like, I don't know, that just really hit me hard, like, how selfish she could be. Like, she's a young little girl who's lost, doesn't know what's going on or anything, and she's just gonna give up her own daughter just to live her life, and she might not even make it out of that situation.
Yeah. And kind of backing off of what Bridget said in the question you just brought up that Mr. Barmer keeps like repeating, the Holocaust survivors that we do meet and we're aware of, they're not going to be living for, I don't want to say much longer, it sounds rude, but
Mm-hmm.
it is the truth. And we may or may not be the last generation that actually gets to meet them. So by us getting this knowledge, we're like the new, you said conductors, right? To relay that message to the rest of people. And you can just read it and watch videos, but at least having somebody to go through life and relay this message, it just helps prevent things and makes you more alert of these warning signs.
The most was when Mr. Barmore talked about biology's role in Nazi ideology, and that really struck me because you wouldn't think that this comes from a science, and he said that you should never make divisions anywhere, because that will lead to more divisions and people thinking that they're more superior to others. And that really hit me because we dug more into science and learned about different species and divided these species, we divided ourselves as humans, and that's the reason that Nazis believed that they were superior as a race and that the Aryan race was more superior. And that also ties into like our modern world today, because it's all an ideology, and that ideology that they were superior drove them to do these really horrible things. And an ideology like that in our world today could drive other people to do the same, and we're still making divisions today. So
I think what resonated with me most is when we were in front of the cemetery and Mr. Barmore was explaining this is something that we should take out of the trip, and it was that how Germans were human beings and this is how low that they can descend. And I find that very important because I have a very hard time finding acceptance in human beings like that and finding forgiveness. And so many people that can talk about this topic, they found that already. They know everything about this topic, and they're able to not forgive but accept. What's done is done, what's done, you can't really change that, but I have a very hard time accepting it. But I'm glad I know that this is the most important part of the trip, because they were human, just like us, and unfortunately, if we were in that time period, I feel like things would be different even for us. I just think it was really important to remember that, they were human just like us. That's how low humans can really get.
And it is a question of what are you willing to risk to speak out against discrimination, against bullying in your schools, against people being mean to each other. There's a phrase that Elie Wiesel said that is in my classroom, and it's the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. You don't care enough to stand up and be counted. You don't care enough to speak out for equality and against prejudice. And that's something that is always ringing in my head. I cannot let anything I hear or see stand without at least making an effort. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I get criticized for it a lot, like chill Sussman. But I have to do it. And I hope you'll take that with you from this trip.
Mm-hmm.